Alright, I want to explain exposure real quick. Imagine an exposure is the same as filling a bucket with water, right? The good exposure, you fill it right up to the top. You don't lose any, you don't waste space. Overexposure means that you overfill it and you start to lose detail, right? So in a photo that's overexposed, it gets really bright, and all of a sudden the bright things just kind of disappear because you overexposed, you added too much. Underexposure means you don't get enough detail, you don't get enough water in there, you're wasting space in your bucket. Should have filled it with more water, right? Alright, so how do shutter speed, aperture, and ISO play into this is what we need to know. Because shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO are the three things that contribute to your exposure. It's like a three-legged stool. They're all dependent on each other. If you change one, your exposure changes. So you need to properly adjust them all for the right effect. We're just going to talk about just basically how the three work together here. Let's start with shutter speed. Shutter speed is like this, and you probably shouldn't do this with your camera. It gets the sensor all dirty. This right here is 1/100th of a second, and you'll watch this thing open. This mirror right here will open, and the shutter opens behind it. You won't even see it happen. Very quick. That's 1/100th of a second. That's how long the exposure happened. That's how long your sensor was exposed to light. Let's slow it way down to 1/8 of a second. Here's 1/8 of a second. It goes like this. You hear the difference? Like this, and now I got my shutter speed at 4,000th of a second. Boom, very, very fast. And that is how the shutter works, right? So you open up, let light in, close it. And the shutter speed is how much time, and it's expressed as a fraction. So 1/160th is 1/160th of a second, right? 1 is 1 second. 1/4 or 4,000 would be 1/4000th of a second, which is very fast. Some cameras go up to 8,000. Let's move on to aperture. The aperture is like the iris of your eye, or now we're going to think of it as like a fire hose or a hose of sorts. You can have a larger hose or you can have a smaller hose. Larger the hose, the flow of water, the faster it fills up. The smaller the hose, the slower it fills up. Let's look at an aperture. That one's one. This one. This is the one I bought. Well, let's pull that hood off. Let's see if I can get this. Open it up. See the hole? Oh, there we go. That's the ticket. So this is a small aperture. Now this is very confusing because a small aperture is expressed with a larger number. If you understand wire gauge, 14 gauge is bigger than 18 gauge. Also think about it as a fraction. Half of a pi is bigger than a quarter of a pi. So F2, because you lop off the 1, F2 is bigger than F4. So this right here is F16. This is F1.4, which is huge. There's a lot of cool little reflections going on in there. I feel kind of spooky. It's like sci-fi stuff going on. A lot more light is coming in per second when it's this big than here. It takes much longer to fill your bucket when you're shooting at F16 than when you're shooting at F1.4. Now every lens has different numbers, so you just have to remember the smaller number means more light is getting in per second. So you can see how these two play together, right? How long light is allowed to come into the sensor is your shutter speed, and the volume or the rate, the size of the hose is your aperture. So you balance them. If you have a really wide aperture, you get more light in quickly, or you can stop your aperture down and less light comes in, but you just have to open your shutter for longer to let the light in, because the object is to get the good exposure, which is filling your bucket the right amount. So the last part is ISO, which the analogy kind of falls apart here a little bit, okay? But let's call this bucket. Gotta open these things first. No, that's not it. ISO. ISO. that out of here. Come on. This bucket is now ISO 100. That's our standard bucket size right there. Filling this bucket up gives us an exposure. ISO changes the game because this is ISO 400. 100, 400. See what we're doing here? You don't need as much light when you're shooting at ISO 400, so you can have your shutter speed open for less time, or you can let less light in with your aperture. So now we don't have to get as much light when we shoot at ISO 400. ISO 400. One more here.
So 1600.
ISO 1600. Even less light yet. See that? So you can change the size of your bucket when you change your ISO. Now there is a consequence. When you use a smaller bucket, you kind of have a lower quality image. The better quality comes with a bigger size bucket. So you lose something. And we'll talk about that in an ISO video. However, the rule of thumb with ISO though is use the smallest number you can get away with. Use the biggest bucket that you can because you get a higher quality photo typically. So that is exposure. We have shutter speed, how long you keep your shutter open, exposing your sensor or filling your bucket. You have your aperture, how big is the hose of water coming in to fill your bucket, and you have ISO, which effectively changes the size of your bucket. And that is how, and those are the three parts that make up your exposure.